Welcome to In Transition, a program dedicated to the practice of content marketing in government. Here's your host, David Pembroke.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be listening around the world. Welcome to this week's edition of In Transition, the podcast dedicated to the practice of content marketing in government. My name's David Pembroke, and I'm delighted that you've joined me as we explore how governments are using content marketing to strengthen communities and improve the well-being of citizens. Now, to get us started, as is the practice of this program, we like to start with the definition of content marketing in government, and it is adapted from the Content Marketing Institute's definition of content marketing. So, content marketing is a strategic and measurable business process that relies on the curation, creation, and distribution of valuable, relevant, and consistent content to engage and inform a clearly defined audience with the objective of driving a desired citizen or stakeholder action. Well, our guest today is the distinguished Australian public servant, Mr. Andrew Metcalfe. Andrew has recently been appointed to Ernst & Young following an extensive career at the highest levels of the Australian government in borders and central agencies. He has extensive policy experience in often contentious areas, as well as in the delivery of client services on a national and global scale. Andrew was the Secretary of the Australian Department of Immigration for 7 years, and he was also the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture and Australia's Director of Quarantine. He was involved in all aspects of strategy, policy, governance, and the provision of client services to the more than 30 million people who cross Australia's borders each year. He joins us now, and Andrew, thanks for being in transition.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks for the great introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Andrew, rather than me go through it, just let's have the Andrew Metcalfe story from where it began.
Well, we could talk for hours about this, and it's one of my favourite topics. But look, the short version is I'm a boy from Toowoomba. I grew up in country Queensland, had a great education, went to Queensland University where I did arts and law. Was always interested in public policy and public administration, and so I found myself aged 20 as an administrative trainee in the Australian Public Service here in Canberra, and then just managed to take up the opportunities that life brings along. So I worked for a long time in the Department of Immigration. I worked on a couple of occasions in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, including as a Deputy Secretary there about 15 years ago. I was a Chief of Staff to a Cabinet Minister, to Philip Ruddock, when he was First Minister for Immigration back in 96, 97. And then, of course, I had the privilege of being Secretary, the CEO of the Department of Immigration for about 8 years, and then Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. I left the public service about a year ago, and now I'm a partner in Ernst & Young, the global professional services firm.
What did you like about working in the public service?
I liked the fact that you were working for Australia, for the Australian government, the Australian community. I was fascinated by the public policy issues. I worked on virtually every aspect of immigration policy, which brings in economic policy, social policy, national security, border security issues for a very long time. And in agriculture, I was just loving making a contribution to the future of Australian agriculture and helping form organisations that were relevant and that were actually helping advance Australia for the community, for the people. I loved working with governments, though. I worked, with numerous ministers, with several prime ministers, and the chance to make a difference through providing good advice, sound advice, good evidence, and then being able to implement issues and make them happen are all the things that I loved about being a public servant.
Now, in order to have had the career that you've had, you must have been not only very bright, but also a good communicator. What did communication mean to you, and how did you apply that in your career?
Communication certainly was a critical aspect. In my earlier times at more junior levels, communication was all about how you were able to work as part of a team or to communicate either orally or in writing to help persuade people about the issues that you were working on. So succinctness, understanding the core issue, and finding ways to provide information that was in a format useful to the audience were things that I learnt from a very early point. As I got into more senior positions, of course, I started leading larger and larger teams, and ultimately, as a Secretary of Departments, I had teams of thousands working for me all around the world, in effect leading multinational organisations. And communication both within the organisation and representing the organisation in its communication with the outside world was critical. Something I enjoyed, but something I took very, very seriously, something I saw as a strategic asset for the organisation.
So how was it that you took that strategic asset and developed it, perhaps in your daily practice?
In a number of ways. As I moved into those more senior positions, of course, it was not just a question of me personally, heroically communicating, but at times, I was the face of the organisation, I was the leadership face to our staff, and I was the face of the organisation to politicians, to Parliament, to the broader community, or indeed in representing Australia at overseas conferences and meetings. But as I said before, I regarded communication as a strategic asset, and therefore I built a network of professionals who really understood communication, so I could use my skills, the fact that I enjoy communicating, but ensure that I was able to get the message through in a variety of ways, ultimately coming back to that point of being able to communicate with the audience, whoever that may be, in a way that made sense for them.
Now, we'll come to the example of just precisely what you did at the Department of Immigration, which was really world leading at the time in terms of the communication capability that you developed in the department. But you've mentioned a few times the focus on the audience. Have you always been a strategic thinker around communication? Because essentially it is about the audience at the end of the day.
I'd like to think so, but I possibly never framed it in that particular way. I was one of those kids at school who liked public speaking and debating, and so influencing people with ideas, being able to provide persuasive arguments, and for me, essentially being able to tell stories in a way that allowed people to get insights and ultimately allowed them to access the ideas that you were seeking to convey, or to identify with, or in fact be motivated with the sorts of issues that you were talking about. And particularly as I moved into those very senior roles, where I was about motivating staff or about ensuring that they had the right context to understand what they were doing, or being the face of the organisation, communication skills and thinking hard about the audience were certainly things that were part of my strategy.
Now, it's very hard to generalise, but what are the difficulties to be an effective communicator in government?
It's the old adage that not everyone is a natural communicator. I'd like to think that that's something that came fairly naturally to me. I understood why it was important, and I enjoyed the opportunities to pass on ideas. But it's very true that not everyone is a natural communicator, that they may be a more introverted personality or simply less confident. But I've seen some great examples of people who may not have been that comfortable but who understood it was important. And they found ways either through their own methods of communicating or working with others to get the message across. So there's no one simple answer to the issue. As I've said, I always started with the audience. Who are the people I was seeking to convey messages to? Whose behaviour was I seeking to influence in some way? Whether it was a minister, a parliamentary committee, my own staff, the media, foreign dignitaries. I'd think about things from their perspective and then try and devise a way to ensure that our message was being put to them in a way that they would understand and ultimately identify with, and hopefully have the best chance of influencing them in the way that we wish to.
I'm often intrigued by that nexus between the public service and the political arm. Can you explain a little bit more about how you went about trying to communicate to your political masters over the years?
I suppose there's a whole variety of aspects to that question. Senior departmental staff, senior public servants, quite often have daily or at times hourly interaction with ministers, with ministers' offices, and so again, there's a whole range of different ways of ensuring that the communication links are open and strong. Trust is a very important part of that. In the best situations I've had are those where I've been able to develop trust and rapport with ministers, and this is not in a party political sense, but simply in a working relationship with whoever happened to be in government at the time, and to ensure that communication thus became natural and easy, that the basics, that the audience would be paying attention when you sought to communicate was one of the critical aspects. Because ministers have such busy lives, you're constantly competing for their attention, and ensuring that they knew that when you wanted to talk with them or needed to talk with them, there was something to listen to, is a key part of it. So that's just one of the many aspects, I suppose, of that sort of relationship.
And what were some of the tactics you used to grab some of that scarce attention?
Formal and informal. Wherever I had the opportunity with a minister and their staff to have some shared experiences at the outset of the relationship, because I worked directly as a secretary for about 7 different ministers. I worked for 3 prime ministers, and I had regular interaction with those ministers on a daily basis, 7 days a week. The key for me was establishing that trust and rapport at the outset, and quite often the best way to do that was to get time together. And the best way to get time together was to travel together, where we were out of an office environment and where we were having a shared experience. That was great because it developed the personal relationship and the ability to work out what would work with the minister and what wouldn't. But also it gave you the opportunity down the track to reminisce about the times that we'd had together. And so while it may seem slightly Machiavellian to suggest that, it was simply a sensible thing to do to help build that rapport, that trust, because that platform then allowed the future communication to work so much better. And
what about the relationships and building trust with the advisors?
Essential as well, and particularly as a secretary, normally I would interact with the minister's chief of staff or the minister personally, but that's not to say that the key person in the office may have been someone else, and on a particular issue it was good for you to ensure you had a working relationship with that person. But of course, for people other than departmental secretaries, for other people who might be involved from the public service in interacting with the minister's offices, again, developing that rapport and ultimately working relationship based on trust is critical. And when it works well, when you see ministers and departments and their staff working well together, you see great things being done. Where those relationships don't work so well, for a variety of reasons, it's just not good as it could be, and that's disappointing. So
now, I referred earlier in our discussion to the innovation that you brought to the Department of Immigration in the area of communication, and it was perhaps a recognition of the change in communication, the movement from reliance on traditional channels to leveraging the utility of digital technologies and digital platforms to go direct. Can you just tell me that story as to where it started to work through in your mind and what it was that you ultimately did and for what purpose?
I didn't go to the role of Secretary of the Department of Immigration with that particular plan in mind. It's something that evolved as I learnt more about the role, more about what was required, and more about what was possible in terms of communication. But it wouldn't have happened without a couple of things. it wouldn't have happened without a minister in the form of then Senator Amanda Vanstone saying that she wanted that to occur. She was looking for the department to have a separate media profile to herself. That sometimes happens with departments, but hasn't always happened. But at that particular point, back in the mid-2000s, Amanda Vanstone as minister was keen for the department to be more able to tell its story.
Do you believe that that's the right thing?
Look, again, there's no right or wrong around that. Some cynics would say that ministers want to have all the good news, and the department should deal with the bad news. Amanda wasn't like that. She dealt with the good and the bad, but she saw a role, given the operational intensity of the department, the interest the media had in the department, that there was a time where, frankly, the department was best placed. Now, that, of course, was a relationship that thus required a extremely strong liaison and trust between the minister's office and the media advisor and the department communications people. The second thing why it occurred is that we were able to identify and bring in a highly skilled communications expert in the form of Sandy Logan, who I'd got to know because I used to hear him on the radio every morning talking about ACT policing issues. And the fact that he had a recognisable voice, a slight tinge of that or twinge of that Canadian accent is still there. So he's someone that you heard the voice and you knew who it was. You knew the organisation he worked for, and you trusted what he said. And so in deciding quite early on, in my time as Secretary of Immigration, that we needed to substantially lift our public affairs capability, we recruited Sandy, and he, working with me and others, was really able to do everything that we could to make the most of the opportunity that Senator Vanstone provided, and ultimately to be quite groundbreaking in the way we went about communications, both with our own staff, but more particularly with the media and the general public.
Yeah, well, there's no question about that, really, that you built a newsroom within the organisation with all of the capability, be it video, audio, stills, text and graphics. You had a newsroom and you relied on your own newsroom, which is really the trend today in terms of storytelling.
That's exactly right. And for me, it's not as if, I was necessarily easily persuaded about that.
Take us back to those conversations.
Well, as a senior public servant, you were naturally quite cautious about the public profile as an organisation, and control is important in those circumstances. Control of the message is important. So I took a bit of persuading that embracing the opportunity to move into our own production of video, of voice, of data, and to commence embracing social media, which was starting to pick up at that time. Bearing in mind that's 9 or 10 years ago now. It took Sandy and others a bit to convince me, and I was someone who wanted to try a little bit first and then see how it went and then try a little bit more. But ultimately I gained a lot of confidence around that process. So we did have a full production suite. It did mean that we could produce our own material. That meant, of course, that we can control the message, and in a media-hungry world where we were in an active organisation that was often in the media, the fact that we could provide a very good service to journalists and quick responses, the fact that we could provide footage that was appropriately produced and able to be used quickly meant that I think we were able to turn around the perception that had previously existed, that the department was out of touch, had closed its doors, was disconnected from the community. That wasn't really the case, but we were able to turn around that perception and really find a way to tell our story much better than we had.
What would your advice be to communicators around the world, working in government as they are, to try to convince their higher-ups that this is the way to go? What are the arguments that Sandy Logan used on you that helped you to take the deep breath and act?
I think ultimately I could see that what we were doing in the old way was simply no longer working. That the advent of social media and the fact that people were interacting directly with government rather than through the filter of media organisations, but the fact that media organisations were constantly after comment, and the fact that if we weren't present in the conversation, someone else would fill the void, and ultimately the story would head in directions that were not correct. But it wasn't the media's fault because we weren't actually providing the facts or the information. So that's not to say that we were always happy with the way every story turned out. But it also meant that, and again, I was fortunate to have the permissive environment for this to occur, and that always hasn't been the case. And that can differ from department to department and minister to minister and government to government. But in that particular period, there was a view that the department needed to do a lot about its image, that we needed to be more open with people about what we did and why we did it. And we had a good story to tell, but the only people who were going to tell our story was us. No one else was going to write the headline on the front page of the newspaper, Immigration Department does good job. But we were able to get out there and let people know about the men and women who worked for the department, the jobs they did to help Australians and guests to Australia, sometimes difficult jobs, but important jobs, and we could provide that content in a way that no one else would.
But interestingly, we're talking about, almost ancient history. We're talking about many, many years ago. Why is it that this particular approach hasn't caught on?
I think it is because of the reluctance in government to have many voices talking from government about particular issues. In government, control of the message is important.
Now, are we talking about at the political level at the senior level? Okay, it's at the political level. At
the political level, and I'm very mindful that ultimately whatever permission exists for the system will come from the comfort that the political level has. In some circumstances, it suits ministers and prime ministers to have officials as spokespersons, usually where they are seen as the expert on an issue, whether the expert is the general or the Commissioner of Police or the head of the Bureau of Meteorology or the Chief Medical Officer. The expert has a particular role to play in government. Where it gets more difficult, though, and depends on trust and the circumstances, is for departments to be generally responding to media inquiries, where ultimately the minister could be the subject of criticism. And so there are some very significant issues to work through there. I mentioned earlier the liaison between department and minister's office is critical. It's, you cannot get out of step with each other. And planning and thinking in advance of issues as to who is going to do what is a critical aspect as well. But I think we've demonstrated that it can work, and it can work for the better.
So in terms of building that trust and maybe looking at some of the things beyond building trust, what are some of the arguments that people could make to their political masters? I asked you before about the communicators talking to the senior bureaucrats, but now the department's dealing with those political officers. How is it that they can be convinced that this is in their best interest? Because it's a way that their story can be told across multiple channels every day of the week, independent of whatever the media may or may not say.
Yeah, I think, again, there's no easy answer to that, David. It will depend on the organisation, on the minister, on the capability of the organisation, and the overall circumstances that exist. And I think there's probably a distinction to be drawn between day-to-day involvement with the media or engagement with people on social media, for example, and what you might describe as planned campaigns where the government decides that it actually has a message that it wants people to hear, whether it's an anti-smoking message or a drive safely message or some other message. And that's where the planning and the respective roles of minister and department can actually complement each other very greatly. So with all of these issues, no simple answer, but the reality is that we live in an environment where The media are operating 24 hours a day around the world. Departments and ministers are therefore having to operate in that type of fashion. There still is the authority that's required on some issues for the minister or the Prime Minister to personally be available and accountable, but there are many other aspects of engaging with the media or social media that doesn't require that sort of interaction. And so my advice to my successors in office is to be very cognizant of this as a key issue, be very cognizant of communications as a key capability, and to plan and think carefully as to the most effective ways of managing the issue and of getting your message across. And increasingly that involves the sort of use quite deliberately of social media, of a media plan in relation to broadcast media, etc.
What's your view about, if I describe them as traditional media and the role of traditional media? Because the general view would be that ministerial officers in particular are very interested and very focused on what may or may not be published in newspapers, whereas what may be impacting the relevant audience may not be, these days in particular, what is printed in the papers.
Yeah, I think there's a much greater growing sophistication in relation to that. Even if you were to go back 4 or 5 years, I think that media advisors and others would be only focusing on what was on the front page of the newspapers, or leading the ABC News, or running on television news, but their time is now also spent in looking at and analysing what's happening in social media as well, and particularly in that instantaneous forms of communication such as Twitter, where a timely and quick intervention can set the record straight, whereas doing nothing means that issues can get a real head of steam up. And so I think that you would find around the quality governments around the world people focusing on all of those aspects. But I don't think that they've yet got to the final stage, which is really planning how they will seek to utilise all of those mechanisms in a way that allows them to best get their message across.
What was your greatest success?
Well, look, I think I'd like to think my greatest success was in helping turn around the reputation of the Department of Immigration, which in 2005 had been very badly eroded because of some very high-profile cases that had occurred around that time, the case of Cornelia Rao, the case of Vivian Alvarez, people who were misidentified by the department, and one of whom was detained for a long time even though she was a resident of Australia, and one who tragically was misidentified and deported. And so that, together with broader community sentiment in relation to immigration detention issues, had really trashed the reputation of the department. And I think the department had got into a fairly adversarial position with not only the media, but with thought leaders as well, with commentators and others, the sort of people the media go to for a comment, the sort of people who thus are influencers in the media as well. So we did go about a strategic operation in relation to that. I asked, when I joined the department in 2005, for the names of the 25 people who hated us the most. My staff said to me, "There's more than 25," and I said, "Look,
let's start with the first 25.
Let's start with the 25 who the media turn to for a comment, and let's seek to reassure them that we understand that we've made mistakes, that we are committed to ensuring they don't happen again, that we're committed to building a better, stronger culture in the organisation." And so that was a very deliberate process where we got to know those people. We showed them the human side of who we were, and ultimately the Immigration Department was probably no longer seen as the worst organisation in Australia. There's a few others that have now taken that up. And I'd like to think that even though it's remained a controversial portfolio and government policy has been tough and controversial at times, particularly around asylum issues, that the competence of the immigration department, the attitudes of the staff, have not been called into question. And it's a tribute to those people and the jobs they do, but also the communication skills of successive ministers and of the people in the communications area.
And in terms of a misstep, because progress is never made in a linear sense. There's always 2 steps forward, 1 back, 1 to the side. What are some of the things that you learnt along the way? I know in sharing a conversation the other day, you mentioned an example of creating video content from an internal communication point of view that was just a complete flop.
Yes, and I might use that example again. There are obviously other things that we did when we look back. We'd say we might do it differently in the future. So, we're all human. We learn from mistakes and we move on. But it was interesting in that there are cultural aspects of our communication in organisations, and in an organisation like immigration that had people there from their early 20s through to their late 60s. Different people are comfortable with different forms of communication. Some people preferred the printed written memorandum as the way that they received information from the leader. Most people were comfortable and liked the town hall style address, the direct personal conversation that may come from the secretary or a senior leader. But adopting some of the more modern technologies that were becoming available, such as simply doing a video and broadcasting it to a person's desktop, became a bit controversial. One, because it was seen as distracting people during the working day, particularly if they were listening to it and didn't have headphones available, which people usually didn't back then. That was before sort of podcasts and other means of providing material on personal devices. And it was also seen by some as a bit of a luxury. Why are we spending our money on that type of stuff? Because, we're having to take cuts in other areas. So part of my communications requirement with my own staff was explaining the need for us to communicate better, both internally in a big organisation with people in all sorts of different locations all around the world, getting that common view, getting that common set of values, getting that common set of behaviours, but also the investment that we needed to make in talking with the wider public and community as well. So sometimes, and one of the issues I probably should have spent more on at an early point, was not just assuming that people would be receptive to more modern forms of communication, but preparing the way better than we might have on occasion.
As we look to the future, an increasingly globalised world, broadband technology is going to continue to improve. The use of devices, particularly mobile devices, is driving dramatic change in the way people send information, the way they receive information. Looking into your crystal ball, what advice might you have for your colleagues who are now directing these departments of state about what they can do? What are some of the steps that they can take to get themselves on the path of being able to become more effective communicators by using content marketing in order to achieve the objectives of their departments?
I think the simple answer is to be conscious of this as an issue and to look at what the best organisations in the world are doing. None of us can predict what extraordinary advances might come in the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. It's impossible to predict. As an anecdote, I'm not all that old, but when I started work with the Australian Public Service in 1980, there was one fax machine in Queensland in an Australian Public Service department, and were one to receive a fax, this was a very big event, a very big event. I never would have conceived then, 35 years later, that I can communicate on a personal device with my son who's in London in a youth hostel, and the only issue is whether he's got decent Wi-Fi connectivity. The change in the world has been profound, and many organisations are still a long way behind in relation to what is now possible. I can't predict what communication formats or methods may occur in another 20 or 30 or 40 years. But what I can say is that governments can learn from those people who are doing it extremely well. There are many similarities between government and business. There are many differences. But now that I've worked for government and now that I'm working for a very large commercial organisation, I see many similarities as well. And I think that any organisation should be, one, aware that this is a critical aspect in relation to them having the edge over their competitors or just doing their job very well.
Would you agree that it's becoming more important?
I think it is, because I think when you look at differentiators, either the differentiator between commercial success and how your competitors are working. So where you have competitors, you need to be really focusing on this, given the nature of business these days. But for government, taxpayers are demanding access, they're demanding information, they're demanding efficiency. And this approach to communication is critical in all of those respects.
Are you optimistic that government is up to the challenge, that they can get moving and that they can catch the expectation and meet the expectation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing some great signs. I describe the level of maturity is probably patchy at the moment, but we're seeing some organisations who really are understanding this as a way of interacting with their clients, with their citizens, in a far more profound way. Some countries have taken this possibly a bit further than Australia, and we all look to the UK as an example of where this has developed a bit further. But I think we're now seeing examples in Australia where it's working well, where ministers can be assured that it's safe and it's a good thing to do. And there are, of course, champions. The communications minister is a champion of this type of effort, and I'm sure we'll see more and more activity as people become more familiar, more comfortable and more convinced that this is an efficient way for governments to operate.
Andrew Metcalfe, thanks for being in Transition.
My great pleasure.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'd agree, plenty of insight and value in that discussion with Andrew. Not only is he a smart bloke, but he's a great bloke, and I look forward to working with him in the years ahead. So thanks again for giving up some of your valuable time to be in Transition. If you do like what you've heard, if you could pop over to iTunes or Stitcher to give us a review, that would be much appreciated. So thanks again, and I look forward to catching up with you all again next week.
You've been listening to In Transition, the program dedicated to the practice of content marketing in government. For more, visit us at intransitionpodcast.com.au.